Hi there, it's Pastor Jane again, here to continue talking about refining our purpose as a church. Now, we've been going through the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and have been discovering that John talks about the church as a family, as being children of God. So today, I want us to examine this idea of being members of God's family. How do we recognize a member of God's family? Certainly not by a halo that we walk around with. So, what does John say are the hallmarks for recognizing somebody who is one of God's children? Well, the first one from 1 John 2:28 is that they have a relationship with Jesus. They don't just talk about him, they're actually connected with him. It's like they know him. He says here in verse 28 of chapter 2, 1 John, "And now, dear children, remain in fellowship with Christ so that when he returns, you will be full of courage and not shrink back from him in shame." Friends are not kept in the closet, are kept private. So someone who has a relationship with Jesus should be willing to tell others about him when the opportunities arise. Now, that's not about forcing the topic on people. That's not about coming up to them and demanding that they listen to you about your faith in Jesus. But there's much better ways, much better opportunities for talking about our relationship with God. First one is we can give credit to God when something good happens rather than just letting it slide by as some kind of coincidence. Recognize it openly as something that God has done and thank him for it. We can offer to pray with and for people when they're in their struggles. We can engage people in faith conversations, all faiths. It just doesn't just have to be about our faith. We can talk to them about theirs as well. There has to be open dialogue, and we can answer questions. We can also acknowledge God's help in our struggles so that when we're having trouble with something, we can say, you know what, I know things are rough, but I know God's got me. He's got my back. See, being able to share our faith in Jesus, our relationship with him, often begins by being the kind of person that people know will listen without judging. We need to be people who give good guidance, and our lives need to line up with the principles we claim to believe. We need to be consistent and real. Another way that John tells us that you can recognize a family member of God's, verse 29 of chapter 2, 1 John, he says, "Since we know that Christ is righteous, we also know that all who do what is right are God's children." Long story, short story, we live differently. We're not the same. What we say about Jesus, about his goodness, his obedience, his compassion, and his love, need to be reflected in how we live too. Otherwise, we're just hypocrites. And what did Jesus say about hypocrites in the Gospels? Woe to you. We need to live life as Jesus did. And I know we've already talked about this previously, but this is something we can't just let slide. Jesus wasn't too good to do any dirty job. Remember, he washed the disciples' feet. That should be us as well. Jesus loved everyone, including those who had little to offer him, like children. Our motivation for loving people cannot be what we can get out of them. It's just to love them. Jesus never refused to help the crowds and even sinners. We should be eager to help other people. And finally, though some people chose to reject him, Jesus didn't view people as the enemy. That's a hard lesson for us because sometimes people will reject us, but we don't tell them because they accept us. We tell them, we show love, we obey God, we live differently because we know it's right. And it's through our example that people will become convinced. So, what's another way that we can recognize a member of God's family? Well, John also tells us that we will desire good things. What's he mean by that? Well, 1 John 2, 15 to 16 tells us, "Do not love this world nor the things it offers you. For when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything we see, and pride in our achievements and possessions. These aren't from the Father, but from this world. You see, the things that we want out of life should be different, not just about me. The world wants good health, wealth, popularity, to build a name, a legacy, comfort, pleasure, and, as I said, me first fulfillment. But the Bible's pretty clear that what we should want as God's children, the desires, first, for people to know that God exists and loves them. To see people added to God's family. This isn't just a private club. We want to see more people come to have the same experience we do. We need to be a part of ending abuses, discrimination, and injustices. Turning a blind eye to what's going on in our world is not an option. We need to help and care for others. And like Jesus, we need to be like him, willing to get dirty, loving everyone, never refusing to help, and never viewing people as the enemy, no matter how they respond to us. So, those are some ways that we can recognize a member of God's family, or should be able to. But how do we become a member of God's family? Well, John's got the answer for that too. In chapter 3, 23 to 24, we read God's commandment. We must believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us. Those who obey God's commandments remain in fellowship with him, and he with them. And we know he lives in us because the Spirit he gave us lives in us. See, I think there's four very important things we need to remember about becoming a member of God's family. And don't do it lightly. Don't do it because somebody's pressuring you. It says, count the cost. Make sure you know what you're getting into. See, the first one is we have to believe that Jesus was God, was God's Son, sent to be the sacrifice, to pay the penalty required for the wrong things we've done. He's the only way through which we can receive forgiveness and a new start. But when we accept the gift of his forgiveness, we need to do so on his terms. We can't dictate how this works. We can't earn it, but if we choose to accept it, it costs us everything. A free gift that costs us everything. We need to follow his directions then. We're not in charge. We get a new boss, and that's Jesus. But that's not a bad thing when we know how much he loves us and how much we can trust him. Another thing that people struggle to remember, but it's very important, is that our obedience is not what gets us into heaven. It's the proof of our relationship and love of God. It's the proof that we're a member of his family. So we should obey, yes, but it's not our obedience that opens the door or gets us any further ahead with God. And the last thing I want to just point out is the degree to which we love others is how we can measure how much we truly love God. There's a lot of people out there claiming to have a relationship with God, claiming to love him, and yet not so kind to others. Well, John tells us that if you say that you love God, but you do not love other people, you lie. And none of us wants to be accused of that. So today, how do we recognize a member of God's family? They have a relationship with Jesus. They live differently. And they desire to do good things. And they know what it is to become and to be a member of God's family.